Hello and welcome to the show. Well, auctions are trending a bit lower. Clearance rates holding at 70%, but the smaller markets seem to be a little bit patchy and could just be struggling. We'll have all the details for you with Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic in just one moment.
Point your clients in the right direction with our range of directional signage. With a variety of options, we have a pointer board for every situation. Made with quality, durable materials, they're built to withstand our varying weather.
Welcome once again to our expert, Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic, and of course CoreLogic providing our figures each and every week with our show on Monday, the Flash Report, and this report every Friday, which is in a lot more detail. Kevin Brogan, thank you very much for your time. Great to see you.
It's a pleasure, Kevin. Good to see you too.
Good to see. They only just held, but we'll bring the clearance rates up now. The weighted average holding at 70%, very, very close. 74, almost 74 and, not almost, both Sydney and Melbourne at 74.5%.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Sydney just scaling back a bit from the preliminary results, but still, as you say, a very solid result at 74.5%. Just a 0.1% ahead of Melbourne this week.
We'll take you to Sydney and Melbourne and give you a bit more detail on those in just a moment. But I want to spend a moment, if I may, and just talk about the regional markets. Kevin, I said in the opening there that some of the smaller markets around Australia seem to be a little bit patchy. It's hard really to predict what's going on.
Yeah, look, I think what we see with the smaller markets is there's definitely a bit more volatility in there because of the lower volumes. But if you take Adelaide, for example, I mean, it's come down now, I think this week, 47.3%. So that's a bit of a fall. But if you tie that to what's happening, we published our hedonic price index on Monday. And we've actually seen some reasonably strong growth in Sydney and Melbourne in terms of house prices. Adelaide's been charting a course of much more stable conditions through that period, but we actually saw Adelaide house prices fall by 0.3%. So, the strength that we're seeing emerge in Sydney and Melbourne is very much, a major capital city phenomenon, and the other areas, including the regions, are perhaps not as affected by that resurgence.
Yeah, I think we've got to be careful too that we don't, draw too many conclusions from what's happening in the regional markets, because the volumes there are much lower than they are in Sydney and Melbourne. We can certainly measure, I think, Sydney and Melbourne and what's happening there with the auction clearances, but probably not the same particularly Brisbane because of the low auction numbers there.
Oh, look, that's absolutely right, Kevin. I mean, we've reported on this segment on some very strong individual results out of the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast, which I think do speak to buyer confidence, for properties that are in fairly short supply, those upper end properties. But if you look at their clearance rates, I mean, 33.3% on the Gold Coast. So clearance rates are a really important indicator. But they're only one indicator, and that's why I mentioned the hedonic price index as being another, if you like, barometer of the strength of the market.
Let's have a look at the Sydney regional markets and where the strength is lying there. Baulkham Hills, I think we mentioned that last week. It's 84%, but still a low number. Just looking at some of the others, Northern Beaches again, 83.8%. That's probably the standout this week.
Absolutely. So look, the usual suspects, as it were, are still there with North Sydney and Hornsby, the Northern Beaches. They are still consistent performers. But I think it is interesting. I mentioned volatility when we looked at the preliminary results with relation to Baulkham Hills and Hawkesbury and Sutherland. But I mean, both of those have sort of survived the final results and are still showing really strong performances. I mean, Sutherland's still at 91.7%. Now we've got all of the results in. So it's low volumes at 24, but to have 22 sales out of 24 results is still a really strong performance.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, we'll take you to Melbourne now. Let's bring up the Melbourne sub-regions. Wow, look at the inner east. Over 100 auctions, 85% clearance rate. Even the inner area at 71% off 138 auctions. They're two very strong results for Melbourne.
Oh, absolutely, and we've seen this trend in both the inner and the outer east in Melbourne, having some leading clearance results. We are seeing though, strength across the board. We've got the southeast at 78.1%. As you said, inner at 71%, and the inner south is way up there in the high 70s as well. So. There's some really strong points across the board. Mornington Peninsula probably, you factor in a little bit of volatility with the lower numbers there. But Mornington Peninsula covers Frankston right the way down through Sorrento and Portsea. So there's quite a diverse range of properties in that sub-region.
We'll hear in just a moment that auctions this week have fallen a little bit in Sydney and Melbourne. We'll give you the exact numbers in just a moment with Kevin Brogan. But before we do, here's James Bell with his auction tip for this week.
Hi, I'm James Bell from the Auction Group. Arming buyers with the information that they need is critical to success at auction. If you put yourself in the position of the buyer, it becomes clear what information you might want to be able to bid with confidence. When I was selling, I would always suggest to my sellers to invest in a building and pest report. Have that done and ready to give to buyers. Sure, buyers may still want to get their own inspection done, but the auction process is always enhanced with transparency. Always try to think, what would make me feel comfortable to bid an extra $10,000? It is the same case with any renovations too. If we have the plans and the approvals, then buyers know that they're not going to have to deal with any expensive rectifications, and so they can release any contingency funds into the purchase price. It's about removing obstacles and doubt. Buyers need confidence, and that comes from trust, transparency and information. I'm James Bell for propertytv.io.
Back once again, thanks James, and Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic. Kevin, let's bring up the figures for this coming week. And as I mentioned there before we went to James, that the auction numbers have fallen a little bit in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, look, they have. I mean, we saw auction numbers increase to above 1,500 for the week we're just reporting on. They've slipped back to 1,400 across the capital cities. So we see in Sydney 501 as against 590 last week. In Melbourne, just under 700 as against 768 last week. Brisbane down a fair bit from 118 to 74. And Adelaide is also down 68 from 82 last week. So we are all still holding out for that spring surge in listings, but the first calendar week of spring isn't providing it.
Yeah, it is a bit disappointing in a way. Let's just hope. Have you got any intel on what's happening in the weeks ahead, Kevin? Are you seeing any figures come through yet?
Yeah, look, they are still very preliminary figures, but we are seeing some gradual increases, but they are really gradual. There's no evidence yet that there's a surge, and when you're only plus or minus 100, it's important not to read too much into the fact that this week there's 100 fewer auctions across the capital cities. There is that natural ebb and flow of activity, which sort of is superimposed over the more seasonal changes.
On a lighter note, Kevin, I think there's certainly going to be a huge crowd at the Tasmanian auction. Only one auction this weekend. You'd expect that, that they'd probably get a lot of people there for it. I'm jesting, of course. But,
absolutely. Look, I mean, the thing is, I mean, there are markets, and that's another important thing. I mean, Tasmania is not an auction state. No. Certainly we see in Brisbane and Adelaide some sort of quite different types of property going to auction compared to Sydney and Melbourne, because they are much more selective, I suppose, agents in the sorts of properties they bring forwards. When you get down to really low numbers, of course, auction is the method of sale used for mortgagee in possession as well. So It's not just the prestige properties that go to auction. And when you've got low numbers, sometimes the results are impacted by the different types of properties going to auction.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention that, because I've just only finished recording an interview that will go through America. And it's, auctions there still are treated like a mortgagee auction. So if someone is taking their property to auction, by and large, most people think that it's a deceased estate or a mortgagee in possession. That is changing, though. I'm noticing a lot more talk in the States and wanting to get intelligence on how the auctions are conducted in Australia. So I think the future for auctions is quite strong, Kevin.
Oh, look, I think it is, and I would echo your findings as far as the UK market is concerned as well. I mean, their auctions are very much undertaken in rooms with a catalogue, and generally speaking, they are houses that people are looking to sell fairly promptly, rather than using it as a mechanism to, as we do in Australia, to try and release some of that sort of market energy. And release that sort of competitive tension to maximise the price outcome.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a stigma with auctions in the UK and the USA where they're looking at fairly distressed sales. But I sense the feeling that it is changing. Harcourts, of course, are very prominent in doing auctions now in LA. We've been talking to Ben Brady, who's heading up the auction division over there for Harcourts, and it is getting some traction. So, and they're turning it around from being a distressed sale to being one of a more prestige sale. So we'll monitor that with interest, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I think my takeaway from investigating overseas markets is that they've got a lot to learn from Australia.
Indeed. And we've probably got a lot to learn from them in terms of technology too, from some of our Tech Talk shows. But you and I have spoken privately about that. But gee, I tell you what, you guys are doing some wonderful stuff with AI and bots.
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, you've interviewed Sarah Edwards with our robotics program, and also with AVMs and other process process technology, and also sort of looking at all sorts of futuristic technology, which is sort of in the pipeline, which is going to revolutionise the property industry, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd love to catch up with Sarah again, because it moves at such a rapid pace. So we'll set that up and we'll get Sarah into Tech Talk to talk about what's happening in that space. But CoreLogic certainly keeping us at the forefront, not only with the figures, but what's happening with technology right around the world. And Kevin Brogan joins us every Monday and every Friday with the most comprehensive wrap on auctions in the Australian market. Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic. Kevin, thanks very much for your time. Look forward to catching up with you on Monday, and we'll have a look at what the outcome was from over the last week. Thanks for your time, Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. Speak to you soon.
And just before I leave you, a reminder that Real Estate Talk is out tomorrow. My special guest on Property News Update today on Property TV is Margaret Lomas. So watch out for that, and have a good weekend, and look forward to catching up with you again over the weekend and on Monday with Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic. Thanks for your time. I'll see you then.